The late 19th, early 20th century German Protestant church historian Adolf von Harnack once quipped that a mystic who is not a Catholic is only a dilettante. And to be frank, for a number of both scholars and lay people, this was the general opinion about Protestant mysticism for a very long time. However, there has been tremendous work done analyzing Protestant mysticism, especially within the last 50 years. And I think that we can safely say that most people would now disagree pretty strongly with that statement from Harnack. However, that does not mean there is a consensus surrounding the role of Christian mysticism within the Protestant Reformation, within Protestant thought. This is an area of ongoing scholarship. There's a lot of really interesting things that have been coming out lately in this area. Now, I will say that Protestant mysticism does function differently than Catholic or Orthodox forms of mysticism. Theologically, it must, because Protestantism in its many forms functions differently than Catholicism and Orthodoxy. And since there is so much diversity within Protestant thought, I do need to narrow the scope of this unit to make it manageable. Therefore, I will be looking primarily at Lutheran mysticism, primarily within there at Martin Luther and Jakob Boehme. All right, let's start with Luther. He's going to be the focus of this video. I have this quote on the screen, which I think is kind of amusing, but it also shows the complexity of looking at Luther as a mystical figure. Luther and mysticism is not a subject for the timid and faint-hearted. Was Luther a mystic? This is not straightforward in any sort of way. All right. It depends on if you're talking about young Luther or older Luther. It depends on how you define mysticism. You will notice here that I have a painting of young Luther on the screen. If we look at Luther's relationship to mysticism before the year 1517, you will see a medieval monk engaging in traditional forms of mystical practices within the monastery. We do know that for a time he sought mystical union with God, but he became frustrated with his efforts. Luther reported on one occasion that he was caught up in the third heaven. This language is taken from 2 Corinthians, where Paul reports having been taken up to the third heaven. Luther has also reportedly had a vision of the crucified Christ, which of course was a very common kind of medieval vision for mystics in general in that time period. All right. However, we cannot just look at Luther before the year 1517. Obviously, I'm picking 1517 as this pivot point, right? This kind of hinge moment in his life, because that's the year he nailed up the 95 Theses, thus setting off one of the biggest societal shifts in world history. Over the next 30 years, Luther's theology grows, it changes, and when he died in 1546, he was a very different man than he had been in the year, say, 1516. But we will come back to his later thoughts on mysticism further into this video. All right, first, so we're gonna kind of tackle this in a few different ways. And the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna look at what sort of mystical text did the young Luther read? What was he engaging with? All right. So as a monk, Luther, we know that he read Bonaventure, Gregory the Great, Pseudo-Dionysius, Brigida of Sweden, Hugh of St. Victor, John Tauler, Bernard of Clairvaux. Of all these texts, Luther engaged with Pseudo-Dionysius, the Rhineland mystics, but not Eckhart. Eckhart's writing was not readily available during this time. And Bernard of Clairvaux the most. Catholic or pre-1517 Luther liked the 6th century anonymous scholar Pseudo-Dionysius. Right. Luther was particularly taken with Dionysius's negative theology. Luther moves away from this theological understanding completely later in life. He later calls Pseudo-Dionysius' writing, the mystical theology, dangerous. All right, and he accuses Pseudo-Dionysius of being a Platonist and not a Christian. What do we make of this assessment? Well, Pseudo-Dionysius was influenced by the Neoplatonists. Okay, the negative way is is usually kind of fundamentally influenced by Platonic thought. That said, it does not necessarily make him unchristian just because he also kind of pulled on Neoplatonist thought. Okay. I'm going to put a little information on Pseudo-Dionysius because I did not talk about him, just in case you want to know a little bit more about him up on the Moodle page. All right. Next, we know that Luther was engaging with the Rhineland mystics. Let's begin with Tauler. Luther really, really liked him, and he would always like him. He never moved away from that. At one point, Luther wrote that I see more solid and pure theology in him, Tauler, even though all written in the German vernacular, than is found in all the scholastic teachers of all the universities, or that could be found in their opinions. Okay. So you see, actually, number one, the prejudice against vernacular text here. All right. Remember, scholars wrote in Latin. Luther, a lot of his stuff was written in Latin, at least early. He comes to write in the German, which is interesting that he finds Tauler such such a strong influence, and he wrote in the German as well. Okay. In 1518, Luther told Staupitz that he had only been following Tauler in the indulgence controversy, which I find really, really fascinating. Okay. Luther also really liked the Theologia Germanica, or the Theologia Deutsch, or a German theology is what it's in English, okay, which he believed was very similar in style to Tauler. We know that Tauler did not write it, though. And Luther published the full text of this document, or this book. I have it up on the Moodle page in case you're interested. Though Luther actually never articulates why he liked this text so much, but it was very influential on him. All right, last but not least is Luther's engagement with Bernard of Clairvaux. Luther makes around 500 references to Bernard throughout his works. He refers to Bernard as above all of the teachers of the church. He engaged with Bernard's commentary on the Song of Songs in particular. However, he could occasionally criticize him as well. Bernard McGinn, all right, who you're reading for this week, has an insightful line where he discusses Luther and Bernard. He says, where the quote begins, for all of Luther's respect for Bernard, as well as the way some Bernardine texts helped Luther clarify his evangelical theology, we must remember that there was a real difference in their views, not least on the central issue that for Bernard, love is what brings about full union with Christ. For Luther, it is faith. And I think that is a really, really critical difference between their theologies. All right. So later Luther was much more skeptical of the mystics in general. Some of the folks that he read early in his life, he ended up having very, very harsh words for. He called Brigida of Sweden insane, which is a comment often thrown around towards the women mystics, much less so towards the men, even if they have similar visions and experiences. Luther also had very harsh criticism for Bonaventure, who was kind of one of the great Franciscan mystics and scholars in the medieval era. And he called his writings just babblings. He described Pseudo-Dionysius and other speculative theologians as being nothing but fanatics. But we all know that Luther was not particularly systematic in all of his writings. So there's also some instances where older Luther does praise mystics. He continues to praise Bernard, and he even praises Bonaventure as the greatest of the scholastics at one point. Okay, so where does that leave us? Was Luther a mystic? There's really no scholarly consensus on whether or not Luther was a mystic. Did he read mystical texts? Yes, absolutely. Was he influenced by them? Yes. A number of them were influential in his own theology. Is he a mystic in the traditional medieval sense? No, he isn't. He completely rejects that kind of model of purgation, illumination, union. That's not what he's doing at all. However, Luther does, he does promote like a very close intimacy with Christ, but it's Christ that comes to you, right? It's not you who are working towards Christ. So I'm not going to tell you whether or not I think Martin Luther was a mystic or not. I'm going to leave it up to you. You have a couple different texts that you can read, and you can dig further into his theology on that. And that can be something that you think about. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.